Hello everyone! In this week's video, I wanted to create an illustration that pushed me outside my comfort zone. At the start of this year, I made a goal for myself to make a personal illustration each month. I made a rule for myself that I'm not supposed to turn these personal pieces into YouTube videos, but this month has been very busy, so for this month I allowed myself to turn the process of this piece into a video. Because I'm trying my best to make an illustration each month, and I felt like if I didn't turn this piece into a video, I wouldn't be able to get it done in time. With these pieces, I like to push myself a little bit and try new things. And this time around, I disliked the piece so much at one point that I almost gave up on it. But let's start at the beginning. Oh, but real quick, I wanted to let you know that I posted a new chapter of my webcomic on my webcomic channel. I worked really hard on this chapter, so I hope you consider checking it out after this video. At first, I wasn't planning to make a video about this piece, so I wasn't filming for the sketching process, but since I have Clip Studio Paint set to automatically capture the process, it captured the sketching part. This first stuff you are seeing is me kind of brainstorming and trying to think of an idea. It then occurred to me that it is mermaid, so I thought it'd be fun to make a piece that centers around a mermaid. For April's piece, I created a picture that heavily focused on the environment. So for this picture, I wanted to focus more on the character, but also the lighting. I wanted to play with the underwater lighting and effects. One thing I wanted to do for this picture is I wanted to try rendering it with my digital painting style. I think it's been a little over a year since I worked with my digital painting style, so I wanted to work with it again. Because of this, I decided to go in with colors right after my rough sketch. My plan was to make things more neat and clean as I painted and rendered the picture. As you can see, I blocked in the shape of the head and added some shading. For the lighting, I was taking inspiration from this picture. I also decided to make her eyes be voids of darkness. I'm just kidding. I've seen people paint eyes in a way where they start with a dark color and then add the lighter colors, so I thought I'd give it a try. For those of you who don't know, my digital painting process is often a bit more loose and blendy compared to my usual illustrative style. I tend to use my standard illustrative style more since it is often faster and often more predictable. But I do often really like the results of my digital paintings since the rendering always has a bit of a different feel to it. The tools I am most using are the thin gouache brush, blending tool, and airbrush tool. The thin gouache brush is used to apply my colors and sometimes blend. I use the blending tool to make smoother blends, and the airbrush tool for when I want softer edges. Because I didn't have a super defined sketch in place, I was kind of playing around with the shapes and proportions of things as I was blocking in colors. And this is what I think led to me not liking the piece, but we'll get to that. As I am blocking in the different shapes, I'm also applying shadows and also trying to clean them up a bit and render them. And at this point, I wasn't feeling too bad about the picture. I could tell I was kind of fighting with it a bit. Like the process didn't feel like it was going super smoothly, but at the same time, I still felt like I could work with it. That is until I started trying to clean up the face more. Something that is different about this character is that she has more semi-realistic facial proportions. Of course, they are still very stylized, but they are more realistic than my usual. Because of this, I was having a hard time deciding on how much I wanted to render the face and what areas I wanted to define more. For example, in my style, I choose to draw the mouth pushed to the side a bit, and it's not totally centered with the nose when in 3/4 view. This is common in anime and manga, and it's something I often choose to do in my style. But when drawing more realistic proportions, if I want to shade the anatomy of the upper lip kind of correctly, the nose and mouth need to be more aligned. And I was having a hard time doing that without it looking very odd to me. I was also getting confused by the shading in my references and trying to translate that to my picture. I wanted the light source to feel very direct and strong, but it just kept making the face feel off to me. And when I took a step back and looked at the picture, I thought, wow, I really hate this. It's not what I want at all. So I thought about giving up on the mermaid idea. I thought maybe I should just do something else. But I decided I didn't want to back down from this. Instead, I would just start again. I still liked the pose and view idea, but this time instead of jumping straight into rendering and coloring, I'm going to give myself a bit more structure to work with so things don't get so wonky and out of line with what I want. I didn't film this sketch since I wanted to really focus, but I could tell that this one was working a lot more and it was closer to what I was envisioning in my head. I was a bit sad I had to dump all my previous work down the toilet, so to speak, but it wasn't for nothing. I feel like my first attempt helped the second attempt go more smoothly and helped me have a better idea of how I wanted to go about working on this picture. It also helped with the proportions of the face, and I was able to get a better feeling relationship between the mouth and the nose. Once my sketch was in place, I started to fill in the base colors. For the first attempt, I was trying to keep my layers very minimal, since a lot of times for my digital painting, I eventually like to work on one layer. But this time around, I was going to separate things like I usually do, and eventually I will combine the layers. For filling in the colors, I used a combo of the paint bucket tool and filling in areas by hand. Since my sketch was sketchy, I couldn't only use the paint bucket tool, and I had to manually clean things up sometimes. Also, I hope this audio sounds okay. This is the first time I'm filming at our new place. I'm still recording in a closet, but this one is much larger. It's kind of nice. I'm not so cramped. And I can rest my back against the wall, which is really nice. Before I would kind of sit against like a wire shelf and it would kind of poke me in the back and it'd get uncomfortable sometimes. Once my base colors were in place, I wanted them to look more blue and muted, so I clip a layer to my color folder and applied a muted blue to it set to multiply. However, I wanted to be able to add highlights and stuff without the multiply layer getting in the way, so I selected these colors and applied the more blue muted colors over the original colors, and I'll get rid of that multiply layer. Sometimes when I have a multiply layer applied to all my other color layers, it makes it so I have to apply highlights above that multiply layer, and this gets annoying since I can't then clip two individual layers. So by changing the base color to the version of when the multiply layer is added, I don't have to worry about that. I hope this all makes sense. I'm going to try to have little examples on screen. Anyways, I started to add some shading, and I could tell I was feeling very timid since the last attempt failed. So the shading was pretty light, but then I thought, no, I want to stick with my vision of having the stronger light source. So I'm going in with a very dark blue that I'll lighten and blend out as I render the piece. Also, you may notice I'm using different colors for this attempt. Before, I was working from a reference that had very white light, but this time I wanted to go with a warmer light, so I made the colors a bit warmer and also just added more colors like the green, and later I make the eyes yellow, since I thought this would really pop. Also, it was very hard to not gravitate towards a Little Mermaid color palette. I kept wanting naturally to use those colors since they work very well, but I didn't want this to turn into Little Mermaid fan art. Once I had the strong shadows in place, I wanted to try to define the softer forms a bit, so I applied a dark blue to the character, and then with a soft brush I erased wherever I thought the light would be hitting. Sometimes for my brain, it's easier to erase wherever shadows wouldn't be instead of applying where the shadows would be, and it's often faster when you have a piece with lots of shadows. It's a quick way to help you get an idea of the shapes and their form. I don't want the shading to be super strong, so I lower the opacity of this layer a good amount. Next, to make my shading feel more painty, I am using the blending tool to blend out the edges. Now, some people got annoyed with me in this video because of how much I talked about the tour box, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit again because it was a big help when doing digital painting. When I am digitally painting, I'm constantly changing between my brushes and their sizes, so it's a lot of going back and forth. But with the tour box, I could just press the buttons or turn the wheel to change the brush size, so it was really nice. It honestly may encourage me to do my digital painting process more. Also, this portion isn't sponsored or anything. They don't even know I'm talking about it. I just wanted to say that it really helped me for this digital painting. And I do really like my more painty style, but a lot of times if I use it, I feel like it has to be a piece that calls for it, if that makes sense. Like for simpler happy or upbeat pictures, I often like to use my illustrative style since it leans more towards that happy poppy look. But for more moody pieces or pieces with interesting lighting, I will sometimes lean more towards digital painting since I feel like it fits the piece. That being said, it also does take longer. I spent like 6 hours on this piece. Granted, I did start over, so I lost like an hour and a half of work. But yeah, generally a headshot like this in my usual rendering style would take me like 4 hours. Next, I wanted to add some kind of subtle highlights. I like to think of this not so much as highlights, but just more of a way to define the shapes. Also, a random helpful thing that can help you learn to shade faces is makeup tutorials. Like tutorials on contouring can be super helpful because they show you where they are applying darker colors and lighter colors to achieve a certain look. I'll often apply knowledge I learned from makeup tutorials to my shading. I was debating if I wanted to merge my layers, but I decided to not merge them quite yet. But I will paint on top of my layers by clipping a layer to my character folder. Like I've mentioned, I want the highlights to feel strong, so I'm going to use a bright yellow for the highlight on the hair. I also use a bright blue on the back of the head as a kind of bounce light to add interest. I apply the yellow in a way that follows the form and shape of the hair. It'll be very bright by the top and then I'll blend it out. Yellow and purple are opposites on the color wheel, so I was a bit nervous about blending them. I didn't want things to get muddy. So to help things from getting too muddy, I added some warmer colors around the edges of the highlight. This part was super fun. I really liked defining the form and blending out the colors. Something you may notice about this picture is that I'm working zoomed out a little bit more than I usually do. I was trying to not get too caught up in the details, and I was trying to let things be a bit looser, so I was trying to stay zoomed out for now. Eventually I will zoom in to clean up messy areas and tighten things up, but for now that was not my focus. Also, hopefully I don't sound too sick in this audio. I've been sick for the past few days. It hasn't been too bad. I am bummed because I was starting to feel better, but then the sickness decided to move to my nose and lungs, so my asthma has been flaring up. It was annoying being sick because I got sick just a couple of days after my husband and I moved, so I was trying to get the house in order while also not feeling the greatest. And my husband was also sick, but he kept having to go to work. Thankfully, he didn't feel too bad. I tend to feel worse when I get sick from things, mostly because of my asthma. But thankfully, a lot of the boxes have been unpacked and the new place is starting to feel more like home. It is definitely getting much more set up. So back to the art. At this point, I was ready to tackle the part I was both excited and nervous about, and it was adding the water lighting effects. At first, I was going to try to draw the effect by hand, but I almost didn't know where to start. So I looked through my brush library and found a water brush. A part of me didn't want to use the brush since I wanted to do things more on my own, but I figured the brush would help me get a good starting point, and I would adjust things to make them more my own and fit the piece. So I applied the effect wherever I felt like it would appear and would fade it out with a soft eraser. Then I went in with a brush and connected or changed any lines to help it match the form and fit in. I am really glad I had the brush to help me get started. I feel like if I had tried to do it all on my own, the shapes would have felt too controlled, but the brush helped me be a bit more random. I did also erase the lighting where the shadows were. Since these areas are in shadow, that kind of means the light isn't really hitting it. By having the brush shapes as an example, I was able to draw some of the shapes myself, like I drew the lighting on the other side of her face and a bit more on her nose. In the reference pictures I was looking at, often this kind of lighting had variation in the color, like a warmer color on one side and a cooler color on the other. So I made copies of this lighting layer and changed their colors by locking their transparency. I moved the layers around a bit so that we get a little bit more separation in the color. And I feel like this effect looks really cool. Next was the kind of tedious process of cleaning things up. I wanted to get rid of pretty much all of my sketch lines and also clean up rough edges. So this is where I allowed myself to zoom in more. I do find that this is often the most time-consuming part of the digital painting process for me. It does feel nice being more loose and free for the first half of the picture, but then when I have to make things more neat, I start to think, why was I so messy? But it's okay. This part is also kind of satisfying since you are getting to see the picture become more polished and kind of come together. Also, about halfway through the cleanup is where I merge all my layers. It was starting to get to a point where I felt like it would be easier to work if everything was combined. Back to the topic of moving, one of the big projects I worked on during the moving process was putting together my vanity. At our old place, it had 2 bathrooms. So my husband took one and I took the other. But this place only has 1 bathroom and it's pretty tight and doesn't have a ton of storage. So I decided to get a vanity to hold all my makeup and stuff. And while that thing was a beast to put together, it took me like 6 hours, mostly because I was putting all the screws in by hand. I couldn't find any attachments for our drill, so I couldn't use that. And eventually, after like 4 hours, I was complaining to my husband about how much my hand was hurting from using the screwdriver. So he went and found some screwdriver attachments and just placed one of them into the drill. And that worked and helped so much. I wish I would have started with that. My hand and arm was literally so sore. I could like barely use it and I had to really baby it. I was glad I wasn't trying to draw for a YouTube video at the time. It was really good and helpful that I took the week off. It was much needed. I definitely wouldn't have been able to get a video done and do all of the moving stuff. Also, I do apologize that this video is a bit more on the simple side and I'm only doing one piece. I did spend a long time on this piece, but a lot of times I do like to include multiple illustrations in a video. But I was still really working on getting everything in the apartment unpacked and getting the house in order. And like I mentioned, I've been sick, so I didn't want to push myself super hard. So yeah, I do apologize that this video is kind of shorter and a little bit more on the simple side. But I couldn't really handle a more complicated video this week. So yeah, I'm very happy with how the vanity turned out. I've never had one before, so it's fun having one and definitely helps solve the bathroom issue. I'm close to having my office totally set up. Some of my office stuff was left behind at the apartment since we couldn't fit it in the moving truck. But I was able to get the stuff today, so I'll be able to do the final setup. So that's really nice. Also, kind of another random topic, but I've been playing this game called Animal Well, and it's so fun. If you're a fan of Metroidvania type games or puzzly kind of games, I totally recommend it. I don't want to say too much about the game because I feel like it's the best if you go in blind. But yeah, it's so much fun. I'm trying to get the true ending, and it's not easy. I've been trying my best to not look at solutions online, but sometimes I will have my husband look up solutions, and he will give me hints. It's like I want to solve the puzzles myself, but I just need a little bit of help sometimes. Some of the puzzles are so crazy. So yeah, I highly recommend the game though. It's really fun. My husband's been having a lot of fun watching me play it and trying to help me solve the puzzles. Anyways, back to the art. Once I felt like things were clean enough, I started to add the finishing touches, like I added a gradient map set to overlay to help the colors feel a bit more cohesive. I then selected the background and started to add background elements like seaweed that I blur out and lower the opacity of to help them seem distant. I also added some fish. I had a fish brush from previous underwater pictures I've done. I used the brush for the shape and then shaded the fish to help them fit in. Next was the bubbles. I used a brush to help me get an idea of how I wanted the placement of the bubbles to be, and then I started drawing them myself. The method I went with for the bubbles is to make a circle shape and then erase the inside so that the bubble has a kind of varied outline. I then add some darker colors in the middle of the bubbles. To add interest, I blotted in different colors depending on the bubble surroundings, kind of like the colors are reflecting in the surface of the bubble. Drawing the bubbles was super fun. I really enjoyed working on them, and I feel like they're a nice little touch to make the piece feel like it's underwater. Lastly, to add a bit more depth, I added some seaweed to the foreground. I tried to have all the seaweed going to the right to help give the piece a bit more motion. And so here's my personal illustration for May. It started out very rocky, and I wanted to give up on the concept, but I'm happy I decided to push through and try again. I'm actually really happy with how it turned out, and it was great working with my more painterly style again. Also, I'm selling prints of this in my online shop, so if you're interested in that, there are links in the description. Before we end, I want to say a super big thank you to my wonderful YouTube members and Patreon patrons for their support. It means so much to me. And thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next week in my next video. Bye!